Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphanlast, aka Skylar Madison, and welcome to the Teach Me to Draw series, where I go ahead and teach new artists as well as artists that are struggling to reach that next level. I try to teach you guys how to reach that next level. So, in my very first video in this series, I said this. This right here is good. Okay, this is actually really good for a brand new artist, a young artist and such like that. Okay, now, some people, they're just a little bit better than this, but every single one of their pictures always seems to look the same. Their characters are always just standing just like this. And then later on, I wound up saying this. We all learn at our own pace.
The thing is if you keep drawing the same things over and over and over and over and over again, the same things all over again, every single time, you're never going to get better.
That's just the way it is. And so you have to draw from references. You have to. Okay, so I have a number of subscribers that I talk to that this series is actually for, and some of them kind of feel like I'm picking on them, and it's not that I'm picking on them, it's just that I want to see them draw something other than the exact same thing over and over and over again. And so they say, well, what do I do in order to stop drawing the same thing over and over again? And the answer is to draw from references. And then, you know, they show me their drawings from references, and usually it's pretty much a character standing in the exact same pose as all their other drawings because that's what they feel comfortable with. And yeah, you know, there's progress whenever they do that, but I don't really see a massive leap. What I'm noticing is a lot of people, when they see a reference, they're not really seeing the basic shapes of the objects. They're not seeing that this is a big box here. They're not seeing the equivalent that this is a big box here. Or what have you, or they're not able to simplify things into basic shapes, whether or not it's more complex than this or whether or not it's something as simple as this. So what I suggested was to dissect the sketch, and that didn't work. A lot of people are being left behind while others are seeing some progress, and I'm really happy that some people are able to dissect the sketch. But what do you do if you can't? Because ultimately your brain is just making assumptions off of everything that you see, and that doesn't help you really learn to draw. You need to train your eye in order to focus on the details. Well, how do you do that? Okay, well, this isn't really going to teach you how to draw, but it is going to teach you how to draw from a reference, and even how to study things in life, even when you're just walking about in your everyday life. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new layer, okay? And we're going to click on the layer properties, and we're going to click red and press OK. Then we're going to create another layer, and we're going to click on the layer properties and press blue. On the lower layer, we're going to call it red. On the upper layer, we're going to call it blue. On the red layer, we're going to select the rectangle tool, and we are just going to draw a square around our reference image. That's just going to help me a little bit. And then I'm going to select the blue layer, and I'm going to press and hold V on the keyboard, press and holding on it, and I'm going to go from one corner to the other corner. And then we go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Alright, congratulations, we just split this in two. Let me show you what that means. So I'm going to pull out my assistant tool at this point. I'm going to go ahead and pull out the parallel ruler. I'm going to create the ruler, grab the handle, press shift, let go of the cursor, and now I have a perfectly vertical assistant. I'm going to create another one, press shift, and now I have a perfectly horizontal assistant right there. So I'm going to pull out my brush, and with the red layer selected, I'm going to press Control-Shift-L, and I am going to draw a line that goes right through the middle horizontally and right through the middle vertically. Now with the blue layer, we're going to press and hold V, and we're going to go ahead and create another X, okay? Going from one corner of this box to the other, and then from this corner of the box to the other. Pull out the red layer, and then go ahead and just draw a straight line going all the way through. And then we're going to go ahead and select the blue layer once again, and we are going to draw another X right here. Well, here we're just going to draw a diagonal, and we're going to do the same thing with all of these. And now we're going to pull out the red layer once again, and we're just going to go ahead and draw a nice horizontal line that splits all of these squares in half horizontally. And we already have this X right here, and that tells us where that is over here. Now we have this diagonal that goes from this corner to this corner, and that tells us how to split this rectangle in half. So we have this rectangle here, and we have another little intersection, the red hitting this line, this blue line that goes from this corner to this corner. Go ahead and draw that all the way through. Okay, and it's lining up right here just fine. Okay, and we go ahead and do it again. And again. Now we turn off the blue layer and we have a perfect grid. Okay, now it's not always going to be perfectly square, but this is good enough for me, okay? Some people, they like to measure things out perfectly and in inches or whatever, going all the way down and drawing straight lines going all the way across and measuring every inch going all the way across the top here and making marks every inch and then drawing verticals all the way down. If that's your cup of tea, go ahead, but I would rather have a more organic way of measuring things. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this blue layer and I'm going to copy this red layer, okay? I'm going to press Control J, Control T, and I'm just going to select the copy and I'm just going to drag it down, okay?
Excellent, right there.
Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to copy exactly what we see in each square.
So how do you climb a mountain? Or how do you walk up a gigantic hill?
Well, one step at a time, one handhold at a time. It's just a really slow, arduous process. And so we're just going to tackle each detail one square at a time. This isn't how an artist typically thinks when he starts to just draw independently. He's not thinking in terms of squares. This technique is just designed to help you focus on the details. And it gets you to be able to just forget about the entire mountain. Forget about that. That's the end goal. But you just need to focus on the step, one step at a time. Focus on what's just on one square. How does it meet up with the edges of the square, the details that you're drawing? How do they match up with the edges of the square? And how do you get what's on the other square to match up with it perfectly, or as perfect as you possibly can? Now, throughout this video, I make mistakes. You'll see me oftentimes erase things and start all over again. Also, currently what's going on the screen, you haven't really seen me draw out a sketch, and yet I'm still able to draw out a pretty decent image. But ironically, even though this exercise has nothing to do with drawing a sketch, it's just copy exactly what you see in each square and try to match them up, you will wind up getting sick and tired of working with 3 or 4 squares and trying to get them to match up properly. And so you'll start drawing little reference lines like this. Here you see me draw out a line at the center of the edge of the square, and then a line in the middle above it, and then another line in the middle below it, and that basically split up that edge of the square into quarters. And I'm asking myself, how do these top cap pavers match up to the edge of the square? But more specifically, how do they match up in relationship to these 3 lines that I drew? And that really helped me out in getting started with this portion of these pavers and how to get them to kind of stretch out for the full length of the image. So this technique will teach you how to draw reference lines. And that's ultimately what a sketch is. It's just you drawing little references here and there and asking yourself, is that correct? Is that correct? And trying to get them to match up. Now, sometimes you're going to find that they're incorrect, and that's fine. You just need to just keep on practicing until you figure out when a reference line works and when a reference line doesn't. And that's really important about this technique. It'll teach you to focus on the details, and it will teach you how to get everything to match up. Now, these days, I don't use a technique that's quite as restrictive. This is not the normal way that I draw, but I do still use grids on a regular basis, and you guys have actually already seen me use this technique if you've seen other videos in this series. You've already seen it, I guarantee you. And at the end of this video, I'm actually going to go ahead and show you guys exactly when I've used this technique in my own way. I don't know if I invented this other way. I seriously doubt that I did invent something new, but it's a more advanced and more freestyle way of using the grid method. I use it on occasion, here and there. Now, notice how often I'm looking up at my reference. I'm looking up at my reference all the time, and there are times where I look up at my reference and then go down to start drawing, but I don't actually draw anything. Then I look up at my reference and then go down to where I'm drawing, and I don't draw anything. And then I look up at my reference, and I do this like 5 or 6 times until I actually remember and notice what it is that I'm seeing, and then I draw a line. That's common. That's very common, where you forget what you've seen even within milliseconds of having just seen it. So even for me, even for somebody who's able to produce a fairly decent image, I oftentimes forget literally what I just saw just a split second ago. My mind doesn't notice the details. So this was actually a pretty cool exercise, even though I really was loathing the concept of going back to drawing this particular technique again, because it does wind up kind of refining your skill just a little bit more. Every once in a while, it's good to go back to a technique that you haven't used since you were a kid, primarily because, it's like sharpening a knife. It just makes you a little bit better at realizing what's going on with your reference and all that. So it's a good technique. This is a really good, admirable technique. Now, I actually do need to use this technique again later on down the road, and I'm thinking that I need to learn how to use color, how to paint a lot better. And I think that if I use this grid method, I think that it will level up my ability to study color a lot better. I think that I'll be able to actually study when and how light is affecting different things, different ways, and I'll be able to make little choices here and there in an image that are more informed and more interesting in general. And here you can actually see me splitting up a square into smaller squares. You see me do that all throughout this video, and it really helps me be able to kind of determine where things are in relationship to another object here and there. It's really helpful. The thing that turned me towards this particular technique was an article that I read when I was just a kid. I was probably about 8 years old. And the article was just talking about how this technique originated in history. And I don't know how true the actual article was. And to be honest, I don't even remember most of what that article said. But all that I know is that it just talked about drawing out squares and how people would, before there were photographs, replicate exactly what was inside of each square, and regardless of if they were good artists or not, they would wind up coming out with an image that was at least passable as good. So this kind of got me thinking, well, if this can get somebody who's just okay or not even an artist at all to come out with a passably good image, then maybe if I tried this technique, I might actually improve. And I was right. And for about a year, I drew this way for everything, until there came a point to where I got so sick and tired of this technique. I got so sick of this technique, I was asking myself, why do I do this? Why do I even draw like this? I mean, I used to draw from my imagination. I think I could draw this without that. In fact, I think that I could have just as few errors without the grid than with it. And I was right. At that point, I got to a point to where I didn't need to have the grid. I could actually focus on and notice the proportions of each little piece of an image and replicate it without the squares. And then I started thinking, well, can I draw things from my imagination? And to some extent, yes, I could. But I was still focusing on where do the lines go. See, that's some of the problem with this technique. It's still you trying to find out where the lines go. So it's not really going to teach you how to draw because you're still trying to find out where the lines go. Learning how to draw is when you reach a point to where you don't see lines when you draw. You don't see lines in your reference. You don't see any of that. What you see is a three-dimensional shape with volume and mass that's going, vertical, horizontally, and towards and away from you. You see an object like that in three-dimensional space, and you draw it out as if it's an actual physical object on the page already. At least that's kind of the way that I visualize it. Of course, I don't know, I'm kind of venturing off into weirdness territory, almost sounding like I'm trying to make crappy poetry. Now, throughout this whole series, I've been saying that drawing is more than just learning where the lines go, and here I'm telling you to use a technique that kind of reinforces that idea. Why would I do that? Well, because there's a lot of catch-22s when you're trying to learn how to draw. A catch-22 is like when you need to get a refund and you call the store that you purchased it from and you say, I want a refund on this item. And the store says, oh, you need to go to our distributor and ask for the refund. So you call the distributor and you say, hey, I'd like to get a refund. And they say, oh, you need to call the store that you purchased this from. And you kind of just go back and forth and you just realize, okay, so there's no way to get a refund. That sort of thing. There's a lot of catch-22s with artwork. You have to learn how to draw from a reference. Well, how do you do that? Well, if you're not able to recognize proportions very well or recognize little details on objects very well, and you're just kind of generally making assumptions off the objects that you see, well, you need to learn how to draw from the reference and be able to recognize proportions really well first, before you go about trying to see things in three-dimensional space and learning that drawing is more than where the lines go. I mean, I still plan on continuing to say that throughout this series, that drawing is more than where the lines go, but this is a good technique. Like I said, I'm planning on revisiting it to help me learn a little bit better with regards to how to work with color inside of an image. It's something that I've always struggled with, so I mean, it is an admirable technique. But one thing that I've come across fairly recently is people saying that this is cheating. Well, you know, this last column that I wind up drawing, I have a lot of difficulty with it, trying to get all of the squares to match up properly. I wind up erasing it and erasing little portions of it so many times that it kind of gets me to think that, wow, you know, I've probably redrawn this entire column at least 5 separate times. That's what it felt like when I was actually doing it. So, cheating or not, it's difficult. It's not like tracing, but I would say no, this is not cheating. This is what helps you be able to recognize proportions. This is what gets you to kind of see the minute details and recognize what it is what you're seeing. You have to actually see and recognize what you're seeing. And this is something that will do it. This is Hooked on Phonics for artists right here. Okay? Just think of it that way. I don't know if people remember that program, but back in the 1990s, for kids that had difficulty learning how to read, Hooked on Phonics was a program that was designed to help kids learn how to read. And it actually worked. It was really good, actually. Now, a long time ago, somebody asked me, how do you shade with a pen or with ink in general? This is how. You crosshatch. This is it right here. You basically draw a bunch of diagonals, and then you draw a bunch of diagonals that are at a 90-degree angle to those diagonals, and then you start drawing 45-degree angles and so on and so forth in order to make it darker in some areas and lighter in others. That's pretty much it right there. Kind of a side topic to the main topic of this video, but I decided to start cross-hatching primarily because it's something that I've struggled with the digital media. I can crosshatch no problem on pencil and paper, but with a computer, I have had problems with it in the past, and this is the first time that I've ever had success with it drawing in this video right here. Now, notice how often I'm going up and down from the reference. This is something that's actually kind of cool with me just having this small graphics tablet and not some gigantic screen tablet. You can actually see how often I look up at my reference and what I'm trying to notice and such like that. And you do get to see just how frequently I look up at the reference and immediately forget what I just saw. And sometimes even how often I get it wrong with the reference even. I already know that this portion of what I'm drawing right here on the screen right now, it's a gigantic screw-up. It looks nice, but it's a screw-up. That's the frustrating bit about it. And I wish I could remember what it was exactly that screwed it up. But yeah, something about it just didn't work out. For some reason. I think it just wasn't tall enough for something like that. I don't know. Kind of bizarre. And I don't know why I didn't really treat it like how I normally do with digital media. I just normally use the lasso tool and move it around and such, but I guess it's just that the last time that I used this technique was with pencil and paper, and so I have a bunch of really strongly reinforced habits when using this technique. Even after all of these years, even though I haven't used this technique in so long, I have such strong habits that have been reinforced over time to where I treated this entire drawing session like I would a pencil and paper. Kind of bizarre how that works out. Notice how often I'm erasing. Notice how often I get things wrong. A lot of the lines that I'm drawing throughout the entire process are wrong. Most of the lines I'm drawing are wrong. It's like a fortune teller. I just say a bunch of things that are wrong, and the lines that happen to actually hit the mark and be actually accurate, I go ahead and continue with those. I'm slowly trying to find the lines that work. Now, there's sometimes when you do this technique, isolating all of your attention to just one square isn't enough, because sometimes you lose the context of the bigger picture. And so you have to focus on 2 of them, and then sometimes 3 of them, in order to get them to match up. And that's fine, because ultimately what you're trying to do is trying to learn how to draw from a reference. And if the reference is telling you that you need to be able to focus on a larger portion in order to get a specific area to work out properly, then you know you need to look at that specific portion. So ultimately, regardless of if you're working with a grid or not, you would still be looking at those specific things. It's just that the grid will actually teach you what portions you need to be looking at based off of trial and error, based off of prior experience dealing with a similarly frustrating area. A lot of times an artist will say something like what I just said, where they say something is speaking to me. And specifically what I just barely said is sometimes the reference will tell you that you need to focus on specific areas or specific squares on the grid. How does it say that? How does it tell you that? Well, if you screwed up majorly in a specific area about 6 or 7 times,
maybe you need to start looking in different areas
rather than the same areas over and over again. And eventually, you'll realize that after going through a really difficult time over and over again with variously different images, you'll see a trend and a technique as to how to look at the reference and how to dig yourself out of that frustrating situation. And that's ultimately what a lot of the newer artists or struggling artists that are trying to reach that next level are telling me. They don't know what to even look at with the reference. And this grid technique is what will show you what to look at what given time. Yes, the goal is to just focus on one square, finish it, move on to the next square, and finish it until eventually you have a fully fleshed out entire image. But you're going to need to have some way of getting these squares to match up really well. And so that sometimes means you have to focus on more than one square. Meaning that if you're starting to focus on more than one square, then that's good. That's good because it's telling you what you need to be looking at. Now, at this point in time, I start kind of working on the left side of the column, and things aren't really matching up very well. There's actually a whole course of pavers that I didn't draw, and I had to actually just get rid of pretty much 90% of everything that I drew here, and had to start all over again. I had to focus on the content of what's on 4 squares in order to get things to work properly. But primarily I took it 2 at a time, and you gotta focus on what you gotta focus on in order to get it right. Even still, even after it starts to actually really come together, I count how many pavers are on the reference versus my image, and I realize, oh crap, I need to either erase or undo a lot of work in order to get it right. But I know that there's specific things that I did get right, and so I don't get rid of all of it. And so what I wind up doing is I start splitting it up into actually really small squares in order for me to get it right. Of course, I'm drawing it really lightly, all of these little segmented parts with tiny squares, because ultimately you don't want your guidelines to obstruct your view of your reference. And so that's something you have to keep in mind when you start splitting up the squares into smaller squares. You need to focus on splitting it up into sections, but yet you still need to be able to see the reference. Now, the Teach Me to Draw series is a really frustrating experience for me, but it is rewarding, because I have always kind of wanted to teach to some extent how to draw, and now that I've actually reached a specific point with my artistic skill, I do feel as though I am at least qualified to teach. But the thing that I guess the student needs to recognize is that regardless of if you're watching a video from an experienced artist or whether or not that same artist is standing there in the same room with you, he's going to say and do the exact same thing that he would do with you in person. Now, I guess it's really tempting for the student to want to get their hand held and say, okay, well, I want you to show me this. I want you to draw this specific thing and teach me that. But that's not going to teach you anything. Like, ultimately, learning how to draw is a personal experience that you have to learn. It's a personal experience. And although there are some universal concepts and techniques, the way each artist draws and the way each artist perceives reality is different. Ultimately, you have to sit down and figure it out yourself. I know it's tempting to want to be spoon-fed, but ultimately, if you spoon-feed somebody, the only thing that they're ever going to learn from the spoon-feeding is the shape of the spoon. They're not going to actually learn how to feed themselves. So here I copied the drawing that I drew and I put it right up to the reference, and with red lines I go ahead and draw out what the reference actually is versus what I drew. And yes, there's a number of mistakes. Some of them are big, but in the end, did I screw up? Is this a failure? Or can people actually see what I drew and see it as being exactly what my reference is? Would anyone ever notice those differences, those mistakes, those problems? Well, if the answer is yes, people are still able to recognize what I drew and it looks good, then no, it's not a failure. It looks fine. It looks good. Anyways, earlier I said that I use a more advanced technique to the grid method, and here I'm going to show you it from a previous video. I guess there's mechanics to a pair of pliers, but there's not really anatomy. So I picked the head of the pair of pliers and I went ahead and copied, pasted it, and you can see that there's two pastings. I pasted two heads of this pair of pliers there. So this pair of pliers is a total of 2 3/4 heads long, okay? And then I go ahead and simplify the shape into two squares, a small square and a big square. And as long as I'm able to draw these two squares somewhat similar to the exact same shape as the reference, I'm able to kind of get it down. And being able to kind of compartmentalize your reference into these squares kind of gets you to be able to see what is the negative space in relationship to the positive space within that square. And if you need to split it up into smaller squares, then go ahead and do that. Now, some people, they get really technical with this square reference technique. Some people like to do a bunch of exact measurements and such like that. I don't do exact measurements. I'd much rather just kind of eyeball it. Now here, I slowed down the video to kind of demonstrate something that I was kind of discussing earlier. A lot of artists, if they can't seem to understand what's going on in their reference image, which especially happens with artists that are just starting out or have difficulty leveling up, what they'll do is they'll split up the image into a bunch of little tiny squares, and then they'll go to their drawing and they'll split it up into a bunch of squares, and then they'll treat each little square as if it's a separate piece of paper, and they'll just go ahead and just make sure that the proportions of each and every single detail is perfect in that little square. And if you're able to do that with every single square, your overall image will look just like the reference image. And those clips came from the video Drawing is More Than Learning Where the Lines Go. It's a video that's in this series. So if you guys haven't seen it, a card will be in the upper corner of the screen right now. I don't know if I articulated myself very well in that original video there talking about the grid method, but if you guys don't feel as though you guys are ready for an advanced technique like that in modifying this grid method to suit this other way that I've gone ahead and shown you guys, then that's fine. Just practice this. Hopefully you guys are ready and willing to just jump right in and all that good stuff. Other people have made videos about the grid method on YouTube, and so if you guys want to try a different way of making the grid, you can always do that. Watch some of their videos, but I don't like doing the exact measuring stuff. It's not really the way I draw. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you guys would like to get more notifications from me, feel free to click on the bell or follow me on Twitter. If you guys would like to see more content from me, feel free to click on anything that's appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.